name is Eileen Gowan. She was 60 years old. She was a daughter. She was a sister. She was a mother. And she was a grandmother. Eileen went missing for about 2 weeks until her body was found. She was found about approximately 8 miles north of Council Bluffs in a remote area, an area that's commonly known for people dumping their trash. There she lay. She was dumped, just like the trash that lay next to her. She was wearing the exact same clothes that she was wearing 2 weeks prior on the day she went missing, on Monday, February 13th, 2023. This case is about jealousy. It's about anger. It's about control. It's about a man who for 2 weeks had no concern about Eileen being missing. Why? Because he already knew she was dead. Eileen and the defendant had a very complicated relationship. It was volatile at times. It involved alcohol sometimes. They had verbal disagreements. We will have witnesses in the way of family, friends, co-workers. They will all testify to that. It was a complicated relationship. But this time it was a little bit different because when they broke up this time, she was staying with another man. And you have to understand they were an on and off relationship for a year and a half. A week before Eileen's disappearance, the defendant and Eileen had broken up again. They were no longer living together, and Eileen was staying temporarily at a friend's house. His name was Mike Brockman. He's an individual that Eileen knew from the bar called Sugars. Sugars will be brought up throughout this trial. One reason why is because Eileen is seen leaving Sugars at 8:30 in the morning with the defendant in his truck from Sugars parking lot. And that was on February 13th, 2023. Sugars is located right over here off Kingsville Boulevard. Mike Brockman's house, or residence, is located right up here, just north up on Railroad Highway. That's about 2.5 miles. You see, Mike knew that there was a little bit of drama going on between Eileen and the defendant. It was nice enough that he was going to allow her to stay there for a while. She ended up staying there with him that weekend before she disappeared. But Mike Brockman also knew that there was drama. And Mike told Eileen that she couldn't stay there anymore. She just couldn't. He didn't want to be part of it. So the plan was for, on Monday morning, the 13th, Mike Brockman was to drop Eileen off at 5:30 in the morning. She has an early cleaning shift that she does at the bar. And then later in the evening, when Mike is back from his job, he wanted Eileen to come back and pick her stuff up. Now, when I say her stuff, I'm talking about literally stuff that would fit in a 2x2 box. It wasn't much. So both the defendant and Eileen worked at Sugars. The defendant was a dishwasher, and Eileen worked the early morning cleaning shift, and she also would pick up shifts in the afternoon as well. So on that February 13th, Mike Brockman does drop Eileen off at Sugars. So Mike Brockman drives from his house down here to Sugars, drops her off at around 5 o'clock to 5:30 in that time frame. Then he drives off to his work, which is in Omaha. At the end of Eileen's cleaning shift, which was somewhere around 8 o'clock, she calls her daughter, Nicole. Nicole will come and she will testify in court. She called her daughter, Nicole, adult daughter, at 8:06 a.m. And that was the very last conversation Nicole had with her mom. Eileen also talked to the defendant. She messaged him, and then there was a phone conversation about that same time with the defendant. And Eileen asked the defendant to come pick her up from Sugar's. Even though they were broken up, they had this on and off relationship going on. So he does. He does exactly that. He comes to Sugar's at 8:30 in the morning, and we will have video from Sugar's showing the defendant arriving at 8:30 in his dark blue Ford F-150 pickup truck. Eileen can be seen as a passenger leaving in his truck from the video at 8:32 a.m. Eileen was supposed to come back and work an afternoon shift at 2 o'clock. But she didn't show. And that was unusual. The owner of Sugar's, her name is Megan Preston, and she will testify that Eileen was a reliable worker. She will testify that she's the type of worker that if she wasn't going to show up, she would text or call to let her know. She will also testify that they were in good communication. They texted often. It was a pretty good relationship in terms of boss and employee. They had good communication. Moreover, her family will testify that she had good communication with her family members as well. She was the type of person that would contact her family members, whether it be a call or a text, especially Nicole. Nicole, one of her adult daughters, she will testify that she talked to her mom every day. So Megan, Eileen's boss, is working at Sugar's. And she's trying to get a hold of Eileen because she's covering that shift, and she needs Eileen to come pick up her 2 o'clock shift because her boss was actually working the shift before. So she sends a message, text message, and calls Eileen, nothing. 2:20, she sends a message to her. And finally, at about 2:44 p.m. in the afternoon, Megan receives a message back from Eileen's phone. But there was something different about this message. The message was odd to her. It did not sound like Eileen. They had established a good communication with text messages, and there's something about that message that just wasn't right. Now the defendant, he didn't work on February 13th. He didn't work on February 14th. And he was scheduled to work on February 15th. But he failed to show on February 15th. And in fact, when law enforcement was interviewing him, his first interview was on February 15th. And he will even state in the interview that he didn't call in and he was probably fired. And that was unusual behavior for him. For nearly 2 weeks, law enforcement is investigating this case. It's a missing person. They're doing everything they can to find Eileen. In those 2 weeks, officers were interviewing many people. They interviewed family. They interviewed friends. They interviewed co-workers. Law enforcement canvassed the area. They were trying to pull video from businesses, local businesses, from the intersection cameras with the public works. They were doing everything to try to figure out where she went that day. They were trying to find Eileen. They even applied for search warrants for people to try to get their phone information so they could get something back and try to get a lead on where she was, where she went on the 13th. But before getting all that information back, there was something about the defendant. There was something abundantly clear about the defendant. That each and every time law enforcement talked to the defendant, his stories changed a little bit. And as law enforcement start getting some of the facts back, or starts getting some of the information back from their investigation, they start figuring out these stories aren't lining up. In fact, we'll talk February 15th, his first interview with Sergeant Roberts. The defendant says he picked up Eileen, 8:30 at Sugars in the morning. He drove to Mike Brockman's house, which, as you know, is only about 2.5 miles away. Never sees her again. Goes back to his apartment. His apartment is Cottonwood Apartments. So they're over here. So he picks her up at Sugars, 8:30, 2.5 miles up to Mike Brockman's house, drops her off, drives back down, goes down Broadway, and goes to his apartments, Cottonwood Apartments. Mentions nothing else about any other stops or anything else. Now, he does also talk about that when he dropped her off, he went back to his apartment, and strangely later that morning he got some messages from her, and then he heard some knocking on the window, and he thinks it was Eileen, but he didn't answer. But the fact is that when we were starting to get the surveillance camera information back, we knew that on the 15th that story was not true. Fast forward February 17th, 2 days later. Now keep in mind, the 15th is only 2 days after she goes missing. Only 2 days after he saw her. And he's leaving out all this information. The second time he was interviewed was February 17th, which is another 2 days. So we're 4 days out now. Well, defendant's version changes. Now his story is that there's more detail, and now he goes to Sugars. So he picks her up at Sugars, Eileen, and then decides to drive over to Dudley Court. Dudley Court is the residence of Eileen's mom. She lives in an apartment there in Dudley Court. So the defendant says he takes her over to Dudley Court to see her mom. She goes into Dudley Court, gets a black safe that she keeps at her mom's, and another personal item, I think a purse. And then they're there for about 5 or 10 minutes at Dudley Courts. And then he drives back and drops her off at Mike Brockman's residence, and never sees her again after that. Now, at this time, officers already know that he's not telling the truth again, because they've received information that he was actually heading west out on 36th and Broadway like he's going over to Omaha. And they confronted him about that. And he denied it. Said he never went to Omaha. Didn't remember going to Omaha. Keep in mind, this is now 4 days removed from the day that she was missing. Law enforcement may have learned some truthful facts about the interview, but the fact of the matter is his version of the truth was not correct. It was untrue. February 24th, another interview with law enforcement. After being arrested on a looting case, the defendant agrees to discuss Eileen with the detective. Now he admits to going to Omaha. He says, yep, I went to Omaha to get some cigarettes. Moreover, he says he ends up stopping at Carter Lake. Carter Lake is right here. It's in Potawatomi County, it's right here. He says that he stopped at Carter Lake, in his words, for a little bit of fun with Eileen. Then he says he takes her back down Broadway and drops her off at Mike Brockman's residence. The law enforcement knew he was lying again, because now we're getting more information back. Now we're getting information that the defendant was clear out in Trainer, which is 14 miles away from Council Bluffs. Never mentions anything about Trainer. Yet another version that's untrue. The defendant continually changed his story as he learned that law enforcement had video of him in certain locations. He was changing his statement to conform to what law enforcement knew. The video evidence in this case will demonstrate that none of the defendant's versions of the story of what happened on February 13th were correct. There was some truth to it, but it was just bits and pieces of truth. The evidence is the truth in this case. The state will present the route the defendant took that morning on February 13th, 2023. You'll see the locations, you'll see the times. You'll see video, you'll see photos of them together in a couple different locations. You will see the exact clothes that she's wearing that morning. The distinct pattern on her green sweater, her jeans, her coat, her shoes. You will also see a black safe. You will see a video of her walking down Dudley Court with a black safe. You will also see a video of her at Burger King drive-thru. It'll be the drive-thru window. There was a video there. And this is at 10:30 in the morning. And this is February 13th, 2023. And you see Eileen in the passenger side. And she doesn't move the entire time. Her motionless body is sitting in the passenger side, and she's in a very awkwardly stiff position the entire time. You will see that on video. You will learn just how untruthful the defendant was with his interviews. Now, the defense may offer some evidence about Mike Brockman or something about it could have been Mike who was potentially the one related with this investigation, but law enforcement thoroughly looked at Mike Brockman. In fact, Mike Brockman's going to testify. We expect he'll testify tomorrow morning. Mike Brockman will. The law enforcement interviewed Mike Brockman, did a phone dump, talked to his employer. Mike Brockman was working all day February 13th and all day on February 14th. Now, anticipate the defense will probably bring in some evidence about alcohol, that she was drunk or was going through withdrawals, but you can see from the videos, there'll be two very distinct videos where you will see Eileen walking that morning. One of them will be at 8:30 in the morning when she walks into Sugars, so she went outside for some reason and walked back in Sugars, and you will see her walk. It's a normal walk. It's not a long clip, but you can see her walking. But the better video is Dudley Court. Dudley Court is at 8:51 a.m., and you will see her walk down the hallway carrying her safe, walking right down the hallway like a normal person. She has a normal gait. She has normal balance. And it will disprove this defendant's theory if they're going to claim that there's some kind of alcohol related to her death. She was not intoxicated on February 13th. The autopsy report will show that. You will see compelling evidence, phone evidence from the state's case. Special Agent Hout, he works with the FBI. The cell phone records from the network provider tell the story. And you're going to see that. You're going to see that evidence. Special Agent Hout from the FBI will testify that both Eileen's phone and the defendant's phone not only were traveling together that morning, which we'd expect them to, but they were traveling together in the afternoon as well. And they were traveling together the next day. Moreover, there will be evidence that will show you that not only were the phones traveling together, because these phones are connecting with the cell phone tower, and they're connecting to the network on the cell phone tower, but there will also be evidence that later in the day on the 13th, that these phones in certain situations are being manually shut off and turned on at the same time. The defendant's own granddaughter, Emily, she resides in Cottonwood with her grandfather, the defendant. Her name is Emily. It's his own granddaughter. She will testify that she believes she saw her grandpa, the defendant, with Eileen's phone after she disappeared. And she will be able to testify as to what the phone looked like. She's going to testify that it was distinct. It was a pink casing. And she knew it. And she will testify to that. The defendant will have no explanation for why he would have it.
Your Honor, may we get a question? You may.
There will be evidence of suspicious and unusual behavior that the state will offer as evidence that you're going to see. And I will just list them. Number one, the defendant didn't show up for work on the 15th. And it was unlikely for him, or unlike him, to not show up for work. Number two, he crushed his F-150 pickup truck for $750. Evidence will show that it was likely worth around $5,000 to $6,000. The defendant pawned a sentimental studded diamond earring that was given to him by Eileen. Evidence will also show that the defendant deposited $1,200 cash, the amount thought to be in the safe, 2 days after her disappearance on February 15th. Number five, there will be evidence that he eluded law enforcement, that law enforcement chased him with lights and sirens as he sped off into Omaha. Number six, Emily, his own granddaughter, called law enforcement because he was making suicidal statements. And so law enforcement had to go meet with him and take him over to the hospital to make sure that he was safe. The defendant also, when he returns from Trainer at 12:59 p.m., parks his truck and starts taking items out of his truck and dumping them in the trash. Lastly, you will hear from two medical experts regarding the autopsy of Eileen. First, you will hear from Dr. Cruz. She will testify that Eileen had 8 blunt force impact contusions to the head, a laceration in her left front scalp, multiple contusions on her torso, a fracture of her front upper tooth, and multiple blunt force blows to her extremities. Dr. Cruz will also testify that the body had decomposed enough that it made the autopsy more difficult. I'll give you an example. Her right eye was missing due to the fact that animals had scavenged on her face. Dr. Cruz will testify that Eileen's body just didn't tell her enough to give her an opinion on whether there was a cause or manner of death. However, the second expert, Dr. Michael Bodden, is a renowned pathologist. He will testify. He reviewed the autopsy, and he will give an opinion that there is a cause and manner of death. He will testify that the injuries, the trauma, contusions, abrasions, all that evidence was evidence of an altercation before she died. Dr. Bodden's opinion is, he will say that the cause of death was traumatic asphyxia due to neck compression, and manner of death, homicide. At the conclusion of the evidence, it will be clear that the state has proven this case beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant murdered Eileen. He took $1,200 of her cash and her phone, hid and moved her deceased body to a remote location, dumped her in the ditch like she was a piece of trash. At the end of this case, I'm going to ask you to hold the defendant accountable for his actions. You will be firmly convinced that the state proved this case beyond a reasonable doubt. I ask you to find the defendant guilty on all charges.